Hello everybody, Roger here again. I was recently asked by someone out over in Finland to tell them something more about what was called the speaker's tree or the talking tree. So I'm out here in front of the Kotonimi or Hautausma Cemetery in downtown Sointula, and I'm going to just talk about the talking tree. So let's go and see if we can find where it was located. Now I could do a full video just on the Sointula cemetery itself, going over some of the graves, but I'm not going to today, because today I'm just going to talk about some very specific people in the cemetery here that are related to the story I'm about to tell. Before I continue here, I just want to point out something really cool piece of history. This rock garden here was made by my grand uncle Alex Potu. Just some neat little piece of local history. It's now overgrown. Now on my mom's side of the family, my great-grandparents, on my mom's dad's side, were Herman and Olga Potu. Now not to get totally involved telling you the story about them just now, but here is the grave of my great-grandfather Herman Potu and my great-grandmother Olga Potu. Now, their firstborn son was Mikko Toivo Potu. He was right here, and he was the first baby boy born in Sointula. Now, Mikko Potu, at the time in the 40s, during World War II, married a woman named Johanna Laura, at the time Hinton. She got a divorce, but her maiden name was Davis. Now, she would have been my grandmother, and Mikko Toivo Potu was my grandfather. And somewhere in around here is my grandmother's grave, and I'm just trying to find exactly where it is, because I sometimes get lost, but here it is, it's right over here. Now, she went by the nickname Toots, and here is my grandmother, Toots. And if you can see, it says Toots of Rauhala, because she at one time owned Rauhala. Back in the wartime, back in the 1940s, my grandmother, Toots, married my grandfather, Mike Polton, or Mikko Toivo Potu. During the war, his name was changed to, or anglicized to, Michael Polton, and that's what he went by the rest of his life. So in the 1940s, my grandmother, Toots, was living in Alert Bay, and my grandfather met her during the war. They got married, and their firstborn child together was my mother, Nancy Polton. And they had a son named James Polton, who recently deceased. Grandmother Toots, her maiden name, as you can see on here, was Davis. And the Davis family started out up in Ocean Falls, but eventually moved to the town of Alert Bay. And in 1949, the town of Alert Bay is on Cormorant Island, which is just out of sight from here, but would be down there, over that way. And the Davis family had a hotel over there that burnt down. They had two hotels, the Davis Hotel and the Bay Hotel, and the Bay Hotel burnt down in around 1949. My mother was born in 1942 and lived the first 6 years of her life in Alert Bay. But then, if you could see along the fence line here in the Sointula Cemetery, all those trees along the beachfront there, it's a wedge-shaped piece of property, and that is where my mother, after the Bay Hotel burnt down in Alert Bay in 1949, my mother moved here to Sointula, and my mother grew up right here along the cemetery on the beach side over there, here in Sointula. Now, before my grandparents, Mike Polton and Toots, owned this property beside the cemetery in Sointula, it belonged to Victor Mackey and his wife, Taimi Dovitilla. Now, Taimi Dovitilla, she used to live over in Rough Bay, Kotilati, at Piggy Point, which is sickening in Finnish. And the house that she once had over at Piggy Point was moved here to this property beside the cemetery, and it was right in this location here. It's burnt down now, but this would have been the house that my mother grew up in. You can see kind of it's all in shambles and in ruins here. But you can see over here in the bushes, here's a standing pipe to the house. What was here. And you can see some of the rubble. Oh, and there's an old bed frame here where the house once stood. That's a long story, and I'm not going to get completely into all the story and details about this property, because the main reason I'm taking you here is to show you where the talking tree was. Now you're probably wondering, like, what the hell was the talking tree, Roger? What's a talking tree, right? I'm going to take you to an old photo here. This is just a photocopy of an old photo that we got in our family archives and records. And you could see the talking tree, or the speaker's tree, here in the photo. Now, it was a fairly significant historical feature to the early days in Sointula, where they built a platform, as you can see here, around a tree. And I'm told the tree was a scoom arm, so it was like two trees growing together. And they had a platform on top of the tree that you had to climb up a ladder to, and people would do speeches there. And they were still using this platform and tree up until at least the 1950s, but it changed as the years went on. But this is an early photo, probably around the 1920s, so over 100 years ago, and you could clearly see the band, the local Sointula band, out in front of the tree. Now, they used to have what was called the May Day celebrations, and in this area where I am right now, along the cemetery in town, is where they used to have the old ball field. So I'm going to change pictures here and talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll come back to the talking tree. So this is an old map drawn by my grandfather, Mikko Potu, or Michael Polton, and it's based off a survey map, Plan 3058. And if you were to dig that up, this plan map is in reference to something that happened in 1924. You can see right here the original survey was done March 8, 1924. This map here by my grandfather, Mikko Potu, was done in April 10th, 1951. Now, it's really neat. So in 1949, again, is when my grandparents, Mikko Potu and Toots, bought this wedge-shaped property that goes along the beach in Sointula. And beside it is the cemetery. And this area is here at that time in the 50s is where most of the graves were. And it wasn't until recent years that graves started to come in this area. Now, this other side of the road where First Street goes through the cemetery is what we used to call the old ball field. And it was still a functioning area for gatherings in Sointula when I was growing up in the 1980s. They call it the old ball field because in the May Day celebrations, they would also have in June, they would have June sports, and as the years went on, they would have baseball tournaments, which is an annual baseball tournament they still have every year, which is in May, usually on the May long weekend. I think it's always been on the May long weekend, the baseball tournament. But in the older days in Sointula, this is the old ball field where we used to have those. And going further back in history, this is where most gatherings were. Salmon days in the summer would also be held in this area. And I'll show you where that is. And I'll also talk about the significance of that area as we go on. So you're looking down First Street as it's exiting town beside the Sointula Cemetery. And all of this, actually, the First Street goes through the Sointula Cemetery property. But all this over here is on the cemetery property, but it was called the Old Ball Field. And when I was growing up as a kid, and before I was born, they used to have salmon days in here. And it looked a lot different when I was growing up. There was a long covered in building here. I believe it had a stove in it, and there was like a long table. And in behind that, where this current building is, that's our gym in the modern day here. But that building that's currently there used to be up beside A.J. Elliott Elementary School. And where it currently is located here used to be an outhouse, like a public outhouse building. I remember it when I was a kid. But they tore all that down in maybe the late 90s or early 2000s. And before that, there was a pile of bushes in this area. Now, way back when my mother was a kid, there was no one living in this area. It was kind of like vacant land. And there was a bunch of trees here. And when my mother lived over there, that's my truck, along the beach property there, and she was growing up in Sointula here, she said she remembers the speaker tree or the talking tree being right in here, just a little ways off from this telephone pole, in line with this telephone line here. Now, when they put in the electricity in Sointula in the 1950s, that tree was in the way, and they would have had to have gotten rid of it. And a man named Ralph Jarvis blew it up with dynamite to get rid of the tree. There's another reason why they got rid of the tree, was because in my mom's time when she was a teenager, it had no railings around the platform, so kids that would go playing on it could get hurt and fall off there. So it was kind of a worry. But if you're in this area right now, if we're trying to find the tree, you could see there is, or where the tree once was, you could see there's this big dip here in the lawn. And if you walk down in this dip here, you'll see, if you kick around, oh, here's one. Down by my foot here, you could kick, and here is part of the root of an old cedar tree, a large cedar tree. Here's another part of that root. And all through this area here, right here in this dip, is the most probable location of where the root wad was for the speaker's tree, because it was right in this area. So that there has got to be it, right in this dip here. So I'm just gonna go down and see if I could get the GPS coordinates of this location. Now, the Finnish word for the speaker's tree or the talking tree was the Puuhupuu. Puuhupuu? The Puuhupuu? The Puuhupuu. I'm just looking here at that dip in the ground just above that telephone pole. And if I were to go like this is now, and this is then, over 100 years ago, you could see the Puuhupuu right here. And when my mom was a kid growing up on the graveyard property beside the cemetery in Sointula here, she says that the railings were gone and the tree was cut off, so it was just a flat stump just above the platform. If you were to go back to this map here, the location of the Puuhupuu would have been right about there. just outside of this pile of bushes. You can see this is an outline of where there was bushes and stuff. So we're right about there. You could see the map that my grandfather drew and the general area of the Puuhupuu there. And this is Dickinson Point and the property where my mother grew up in the graveyard, the cemetery here. And across the street from First Street is where I was standing in that little dip, and that is the location of the Puuhupuu, right there. So I'm just gonna show you, walk around where the Puuhupuu once stood. Little dip in the ground here, where you could clearly see the root wad where the Puuhupuu was. And I'll just post right here where the GPS coordinates are of the Puuhupuu. Map is also pretty cool because my grandfather showed who lived in the area. And if you're looking down at the graveyard property, you can see our old boathouse, where the house once was. And over here at the point, at Dickinson Point, also known as Koltanimi or Toke Point, you could see here, or the Graveyard Point, because it's beside the graveyard. Those are all local place names for Dickinson Point. Right here, you could see there was a house there. Now, when my mom bought Rauhla in the late 1950s, early 1960s, she lived out there, and then my sister got old enough to come into town to go to school. In the early 1960s, she bought this house, which was the shoemaker's house at the time, the old shoemaker that lived in Sointula, and she moved that house over right about in here, and she lived there with my oldest sister when she was first starting school. I'll go show you where that is because the building still stands. Now, I'm told in modern day Finnish, you wouldn't say the talking tree or the speaker's tree as puuhupuu. There's a different word you would use, but you have to also remember that the old-time Finns, the settlers here, used an older form of Finnish, and as Finland evolved differently, separated by thousands of kilometers, because Sointula is in Canada, the language changed in Finland, and the name Puuhupuu stuck. During the time of the Calvin Cancer, they would have speeches at the Puuhupuu, and it was a really important part of our town's history. So I think it deserves its own short little video, and I'm right here, right now, in front of the old shoemaker's house. So this house here, it's just a 2-room shack, and it once was at Dickinson Point, or the Graveyard Point, Toke Point, Koltanimi, and it was the shoemaker's house. My mom bought it in the early 1960s, again when my sister went to school, and moved it to the graveyard property. All right, that's all I got to say for today. So if you want to follow along my video series as I go explore more locations and talk about the local history and such, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. All right, ciao.
The Malcolm Islander where the waters gleam, mountains rise like a distant dream. He walks where the forest keeps its slow. The Malcolm Islander forever.